Says we're in a practice session yet, Kip.
There we go.
Good evening, folks. I see people rolling into our virtual meeting room. Welcome, good evening. We'll give this another minute or so, make sure everybody gets in. So just bear with us just for another moment. Okay, let's go ahead and get started so we can stay on time. Appreciate everybody joining us this evening. I am Nick Pinizzotto with the National Deer Association. Ironically, also a native Pennsylvanian, so we're living this together. I want to get that out there. We have a good program for you this evening. As good as a program about chronic wasting disease can be, we recognize this is not a fun subject. However, it is a critically important one, especially if you're somebody that cares about deer and wildlife conservation. And obviously, if you're spending the evening with us here, you're one of those people. So thank you. We very much appreciate it. We're going to give you a number of different perspectives here, which I think you'll appreciate. So we're going to start at the local level. You're going to hear from Bill Williams, who's your Northeast Region I&E Supervisor. Then we're going to hear from Brian Richards. He is from USGS. He is a wildlife biologist, and he is the Emerging Disease Coordinator, and he is going to give us a national perspective on CWD. Then you'll hear from another Pennsylvanian, Kip Adams, my colleague at the National Deer Association. He's our Chief Conservation Officer. And then Andrea Corman, she's a CWD biologist with the Pennsylvania Game Commission. She's going to tell you what the Pennsylvania Game Commission is doing to help control this disease. And also with us this evening, I want to mention that we have Scott Weber and Eric Gagne from the Pennsylvania Wildlife Futures Program, which is a partnership between the Pennsylvania Game Commission and the University of Pennsylvania, and more specifically Penn Vet. Scott is the communications liaison and senior research investigator, and Eric is an assistant professor of wildlife disease ecology. So if you haven't noticed already, everybody on this screen is much smarter than I am, and that's why I'm the moderator. So you're going to get to hear them present, and my job is just to handle air traffic control. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Bill Williams. Bill, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Again, my name is Bill Williams. I'm the Information and Education Supervisor at the Game Commission's Northeast Region. And we're going to start off with giving you some basics on CWD. And I'd like to also provide to you the status of CWD monitoring here in the Northeast region. So we'll pull up my presentation here. Some of the basics on CWD. Chronic wasting disease, CWD, is unfortunately an always fatal disease of cervids, and in Pennsylvania, that is our deer and elk populations. There is no vaccine or treatment for CWD, and looks can be deceiving when you're out there in the field and looking at a deer. Some of the symptoms of CWD include drastic weight loss, hence the name, lack of coordination, drooling, drooping ears, lack of fear of people, and excessive thirst and urination. So if you look at that deer on the right, it may be exhibiting some of these signs. However, it may not have a disease. It may not have CWD. Other diseases can cause these sort of things, and CWD can mimic those diseases. It has an incubation period, meaning that the time from infection to when the deer is showing outward signs could be 18 to 24 months. So that deer on the left, although it looks very healthy, can be infected with the prion that causes the disease and eventually become sick, and of course end up dying from that from CWD. Transmissions of the prion comes in two basic ways, direct and indirect means. CWD can be spread through deer-to-deer contact. Deer are very social animals, and they tend to come in contact quite a bit, especially family units. So it can be spread that way. The biggest concern, however, is that CWD prions are shed in the saliva urine and feces of the deer, and these prions can remain infective in the environment for many years. A key point here is that reducing deer numbers, so far that we know, is the only known and effective method of managing chronic wasting disease. So what are we doing here in the Northeast as far as monitoring goes? Well, during the firearm season, we have our deer aging teams visiting meat processors throughout our 13-county region. We get a very good sampling of deer throughout our region. And this past hunting season, we tested 517 samples of deer for CWD. So we've had 517 hunter harvest samples. In addition to that, we test deer for CWD throughout the year in the case of clinical suspects. And these are deer that are showing any of the signs of chronic wasting disease that I mentioned just a short time ago. We often get calls reporting deer that are sick looking, and the caller generally says, I have got a deer and it looks like it has CWD. So they're tested. And by other, if we do have escapees from deer farms, they would be tested also. All of the results, whether it was clinical suspects or hunter harvest sampling of this past year, and in fact, since we've been detecting testing deer throughout the years, have shown up as not detected. Now, that doesn't mean that they may not have the disease, but it could not be detected in those samples. However, it is knocking on our door. We are kind of fortunate, and speaking of knocking on the door, I'll knock on wood, because we are the only region in the state so far who hasn't had any positive tests for CWD in our deer population. But if you look at disease management area 2, specifically in the Northeast, a portion of that DMA, you'll see some positives that have shown up in Juniata and Snyder counties, and that is adjacent to Northumberland in the Northeast region there, separated only by the Susquehanna River at this point. We need your help. By that I mean help from the hunters. If you see deer that are exhibiting signs of CWD, we want people to call those in so we can get those deer tested. And if you hunt in a CWD DMA, be aware of the regulations and don't take high-risk parts out of those areas to help prevent human introduction of CWD across the state or into the Northeast region. How can hunters help? If they are hunting in a DMA, submit your deer for testing. There are head collection units throughout the DMAs provided by the Game Commission for free testing. Hunters outside of DMAs can get their deer tested through the Pennsylvania Veterinary Laboratory in Harrisburg. There is a fee involved with that. For those hunting in disease management areas, understand and follow the regulations. Within these DMAs, it is unlawful to feed deer. This causes deer to congregate and potentiates the spread. It is also unlawful to use urine-based attractants. And lastly, it is unlawful to transport high-risk parts out of the disease management areas. So what are those high-risk parts? They include the brain, eyes, lymph nodes, tonsils, spinal cord, and spleen. The importance of this regulation is to prevent people from dumping high-risk parts on the landscape in unaffected areas, possibly contaminating the soil in that area or exposing healthy deer or elk to the disease. And we always provide a lot of information on chronic wasting disease in the annual Pennsylvania Hunting and Trapping Digest. So that's a bit of an update from the Northeast region. I realize some of the other regions had a little more to contribute as far as what is happening within DMAs. But again, we are somewhat fortunate in the Northeast, at least to date, that the disease has not been affected in our region. With that, I'll turn it back over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate that.
Mhm.
All right. Now we're going to take a look at what's going on across the country. CWD certainly isn't something that's just happening here in Pennsylvania. It's happening in a lot of places, and fortunately and unfortunately, we have Brian Richards, who gets to have his finger on the pulse of everything going on with this disease. And it's to our fortune for sure that he's here to speak to us tonight. So Mr. Richards, the floor is yours.
All right. Should be able to see that background now and hear me.
It's coming up. Yep, there we are.
All right, excellent. And title slide should come up. I shut my camera off to preserve bandwidth a little bit, and we can go ahead and get started. So thank you much, Nick. Good evening. Again, my name is Brian Richards, and I am a wildlife biologist at the U.S. Geological Survey's National Wildlife Health Center here in Madison, Wisconsin. Our science center, which you can see our main building pictured there, conducts diagnostics, wildlife disease research, and we provide epidemiological and technical assistance to state, tribal, and federal partners. We are the only federal facility with a focus solely on wildlife health for the benefit of wildlife. Also recognized by a couple international bodies, first the World Organization for Animal Health, and we're recognized as a collaborating center for wildlife health and biodiversity, and also by the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, and that's as a reference center for wildlife health and wildlife disease diagnostics. We've been around since 1975. Since that time, been involved with a number of pretty high profile and important wildlife disease issues, starting from lead poisoning through West Nile virus, white nose syndrome, highly pathogenic avian influenza, more recently, things like rabbit hemorrhagic disease and the impacts of SARS coronavirus type 2 in wildlife. We've been involved with CWD since 2002, essentially the day after it was detected and confirmed in the state of Wisconsin. I've been at the center since 2004 and with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department for a little over a decade prior to that. This evening, I'll be giving you a pretty short primer, an update on CWD in North America. But before I start, I would like to thank the sponsors, National Deer Association, Pennsylvania Game Commission, and the Penn Wildlife Futures Program for sponsoring the event. And I'd like to thank you, members of the audience, for taking the time and effort to attend tonight. So I'm going to start with a newspaper article. It came out about, I guess, 2 or 3 weeks ago by Marcus Schneck and published in Penn Live. So author goes on, deer killed by hunters last hunting season in Pennsylvania's hot zone for CWD were found to be infected at a rate of 14%, up from 8% the previous hunting license year. Pennsylvania Game Commission tested more than 12,000 whitetails for CWD during last year's hunting season. Of those, 218 were found to have CWD. And Matthew Schnupp, the director of the Game Commission's Bureau of Wildlife Management, described that as a punch in the stomach for wildlife managers and hunters in Pennsylvania. One of your commissioners, Timothy Layton, said the only hope for making things better in the established area and for keeping CWD at bay elsewhere in the state is for hunters to help wildlife managers. And the author goes on to identify that hunter resistance to deer reduction efforts can be a stumbling block to efforts to battle the disease. So summarizing from the article, I'd say CWD seems to have a pretty good foothold in Pennsylvania, and it's likely getting worse. Management efforts don't seem to be working exceptionally well. And it's pointed out a couple times that if hunters don't support and actively engage in management, that's not likely to change. In fact, CWD will continue to grow and spread to other areas of the state. So that's a reality that's been experienced over and over again in other states and provinces. And it's pretty simple for me to predict that the road you seem to be headed down right now could easily lead to a lot more of those punches to the stomach that Matthew described. So let's start with a few observations about CWD. What's it doing? Well, it's spreading geographically, both nationally and in Pennsylvania. Prevalence, or the proportion of the population affected with CWD, is growing in many locations, including in Pennsylvania. CWD kills some deer directly, but what may be more important is that CWD results in a progressive neurological degeneration and thus predisposes deer to other sources of mortality, like getting hit by a car, arrow, or a bullet. Whatever the ultimate cause, deer with CWD tend to die much sooner than they would have otherwise. But what about the consequences? First, CWD is really expensive. Every facet of CWD costs a lot of dollars for natural resource agencies, including your game commission, to try and deal with. On top of that, CWD has tended to erode stakeholder trust in their management agencies. But in the longer term, there's some other pretty substantial impacts. Deer populations tend to suffer over the long term. Initially, you might see a beginning of a decline in harvestable surplus, that segment of the population you hunt every year. And in a few areas with very high prevalence over a protracted period of time, CWD has actually driven population decline. Demographic shifts in the herd, moving towards younger age classes, are also likely to occur in the long run. If your goal is to produce older aged animals, those often managed for and desired by hunters, you're likely not to be able to sustain that goal. Hunter behavior is also predicted to change over time. So if you hunt in an area with high prevalence, maybe in the 30 to 40 to 50% range, either you or a family member is likely to change your hunting behavior, either choosing to hunt elsewhere or stop deer hunting altogether. And that'll circle back to the ability of the Game Commission to manage not only deer, but all of the other resources that rely on hunting license dollars. So I like to include a photo of a deer, just like everybody does in a discussion of CWD. So here's one, but can you tell whether this deer has CWD or not? Nobody can by looking at it. I certainly can't. A deer with CWD looks and acts perfectly normal for many, many months before it starts to develop that classical wasting appearance. But as was mentioned earlier, if this deer has CWD, she's actively shedding infectious agent, prion protein, into the environment, and she's capable of infecting other deer, even though she looks just fine. And this is an incredible issue for natural resource managers. Most hunters, even in very hard-hit areas, have never seen a deer in the clinical phase of CWD. So if they haven't really seen it, it's really hard for some to fathom that that silent killer is really out there, but it is. This slide lists some of the characteristics of CWD. It's a transmissible spongiform encephalopathy in the same category diseases, which include Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease in humans and bovine spongiform encephalopathy in cattle. The hallmarks of all TSEs include a long incubation period, progressive neurological degeneration, a relatively brief clinical phase followed by death. CWD and its cousins scrapie and sheep are unique among TSEs in that diseased animals shed infectious agent via bodily fluids like saliva, urine, and feces, and can directly infect other herd or flock members. Deer become infected by ingesting or inhaling that infectious agent. And transmission can be via direct contact or indirect contact with a contaminated environmental foam mite. Vertical or doe-to-fawn transmission prior to birth has been documented and plays an unknown role in nature. Incubation period is protracted, followed by a brief clinical phase. Infected animals shed infectious agent long before the onset of clinical disease, and shed prions can persist in the environment for years, likely decades, and serve as a reservoir of infectivity for other animals. We tend to see higher infection rate in males and in older age classes of each sex. So we can test for disease in live deer, but it's really challenging. So the majority of surveillance samples are collected from hunter-killed animals post-mortem. At this time, management tools are pretty limited, and there's little evidence of widespread genetic resistance. So the combination of these characteristics really does make CWD extremely challenging to manage in free-ranging populations. So what does CWD do at the individual deer level? Well, it's literally a death sentence for every deer that gets it. And if disease runs its full course, it's likely to be a couple of years, maybe on average. But due to that progressive neurological degeneration, most CWD positive deer die of some other factor, and they die even sooner. That's critical from the population standpoint. Well, that was kind of the very basics about what CWD is and what it does to individual deer. But why should we care? After all, there's a lot of deer out there. In 2016, Drs. John Fisher and Mike Miller presented a paper at the North American Natural Resources Conference where they described our first 50 years of experience with CWD. And in it, they postulated two overarching reasons why we might be concerned about CWD. First, that CWD, especially in the long term, tends to be very hard on deer populations. The second is that we cannot rule out that CWD could someday become a human health issue. That latter remains an open question, but not consuming venison from CWD positive deer is what human health experts recommend. Now I'm going to take some time, go through some data and science regarding what CWD might be doing at the population level to cervids, or members of the deer family. Here is a map of the current documented distribution of CWD in North America. It's now been detected in 26 states and 3 Canadian provinces in free-ranging and/or commercial captive facilities. On the captive side, CWD has been detected in approximately 150 facilities in the United States and 128 in Canada. On this map, the polygons represent CWD in wild deer, elk, or moose, and the dots represent commercial captive deer operations where CWD has been detected. CWD has also been detected in South Korea, Norway, Finland, and Sweden. So pretty clear, has a substantial footprint here in North America, both in wild and captive deer. So I'm going to take you back in time to 2005. And this was just a few short years after CWD was detected in the state of Wisconsin, and right after CWD was detected both in New York and West Virginia. That map looks quite a bit different than it does today. Here's early 2013, right after Pennsylvania had announced their initial detections in wild deer. And you note a single captive deer farm had been detected in Pennsylvania at that time. I think it was in 2012. Here we are back at the current time. Just to reflect, Pennsylvania, the rest of North America looks quite a bit different than it did a mere 8 years ago. Now I'm going to hone in on your region. This is right after your initial detection in 2012. CWD had also been documented in West Virginia, Maryland, and a single county in Virginia. Plus you had that initial captive facility in Adams County. Now back to the current time. CWD had been detected in wild deer in 14 counties in Pennsylvania, more to the south as well. It's also been confirmed in 28 captive deer facilities in Pennsylvania. It's important for me to note that this map includes an entire county, even if there's only a single or 2 wild positives in that county. That's the level of data I have access to, and at the national level, it's fine. But when I zoom into smaller areas like this one, it does tend to exaggerate where CWD has been confirmed to date. That being said, the way CWD tends to spread, it may not be an exaggeration for all that long. Now I'm going to show you some data from my home state of Wisconsin. The red squares are 1-mile sections where CWD has been confirmed in 1 or more hunter-killed deer. CWD first confirmed back in 2002 in Wisconsin, and the State Department of Natural Resources conducted a massive amount of surveillance in the next few years. Over 40,000 samples were collected in 2002, and those were primarily from hunter-killed deer. So this is a pretty good approximation of where CWD was in 2005. I'm going to flash forward all the way up to the current time. CWD was detected in 1,578 deer in Wisconsin last year alone, and that was out of just under 19,000 samples collected from hunters. Remember, you had 218 positives in Pennsylvania out of 12,000 samples. In Wisconsin, CWD has now been picked up in 32 of 72 counties in wild deer, and we're over 8,000 individual CWD positive wild deer at this point in time. Sampling in Wisconsin is voluntary. So those numbers are just merely a subset of the actual number of CWD positive deer killed by hunters and what exists today in the wild. Plus we have 29 captive facilities where CWD has been detected. So I would argue, taking a look at those 3 sets of maps, that there's been a pretty dramatic expansion in CWD's geographic footprint nationally, in my home state of Wisconsin, also in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. But what about prevalence? Is disease increasing as well as spreading? Well, here's some data back from Wisconsin. The 3 red dots you see on that map of the southern 2/3 of the state of Wisconsin is where CWD is performing incredibly well. And I'm going to zoom in now on one of those prevalence charts. And the curves on this chart represent the proportion of deer that tested positive and how that increased over time. You can see in this zone that CWD was pretty much non-existent back in 2002 and for the next several years. Then it really took off. Today, if you shoot a mature buck in this zone, it's literally 50-50 odds that deer has CWD. 1 in 3 odds in adult does and yearling bucks, and 1 in 5 in yearling does. This is an image from the Game Commission website showing CWD testing results. I believe this shows results for all samples collected last year, so the reported percent positive is pretty small, less than 2%. But look at the rate of growth in the bar chart on the lower right. The rate of detecting positives in Pennsylvania is increasing, and it's increasing rapidly. This time I selected just adult males and just hunter-killed deer. So I'm not sure the exact geographic extent, but I believe it's likely the CWD DMUs in Pennsylvania. Now you're up at almost 5% prevalence. And we'd expect that, as adult males are more likely to be CWD positive than other herd segments. But look at the growth trend in the lower right. I sketched an exponential growth curve over the top of that chart. It fits pretty good. So unfortunately, I'd have to argue that CWD appears to be performing in your core area in a fashion very similar to that in Wisconsin, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, and a few other locales. And the question is, why wouldn't it? What is Pennsylvania doing today? What are you willing to do tomorrow that will alter that trend and the outcomes? So earlier I mentioned one of the potential long-term outcomes is hunters changing their behavior in CWD zones. So I've got a good friend here in Wisconsin who's very active in both CWD and in social media. And a few months ago, he started soliciting what he refers to as CWD stories from some of his contributors. And here's one from the very core of the CWD area in Wisconsin. So in 2014, a group of hunting buddies leased 280 acres, literally in the heart of CWD. Leased the ground for 4 seasons. In that time frame, every single buck they killed was CWD positive, over a dozen positive deer. It became so bad that we gave up the lease and checked out. We couldn't stand shooting the deer and not being able to eat them. It's pretty sobering. I cannot imagine really wanting to hunt there myself. So what can be done about CWD? And what is the Commonwealth willing to do about it? And remember that statement coming from Commissioner Layton about needing hunter support. It's very true. Now, I have to insert a caveat here when discussing management options. Pennsylvania is not my home state. I have no management prerogative or authority in your state or anywhere else for that matter. I cannot tell you what to do. Ultimately, that's your choice, not mine. But there are some opportunities should the Commonwealth want to proceed. It's kind of a 2-part story. First, if you don't have CWD, other states and jurisdictions would recommend that you consider doing everything you can to keep it that way. And you have some control here. First, it's possible to identify pathways, how CWD could come to you. And people are involved in most of those. Then implementing regulations to stop or slow down those processes. But regulations, at least on their own, are not likely enough. Providing information and education to stakeholders is key. A well-informed populace is much more likely to make better choices and reduce risk. Another caveat, if you're really close, adjacent to where CWD is in the wild, these precautionary measures will likely be less effective. Because after all, you might be able to get humans to stop moving CWD, but deer will continue to move it themselves, and that's much harder to address. Part 2, if you have CWD, do something about it, but do it in measurable and meaningful ways that can actually alter outcomes. There's an example I'd like to discuss in many audiences. Pennsylvania and other states are doing a lot of disease surveillance right now. That's great. Learning about how CWD is performing is a really good idea. But surveillance itself is not active disease management. Surveillance is watching. It cannot alter disease outcomes. So early on, I mentioned that the toolbox for CWD doesn't have a tremendous amount in it. Well, what would the toolbox look like if it had a lot of great tools in it? For CWD, here's some of the ones I personally think would be useful. Maybe someday we'll have them. We don't have them today, and likely will not for a pretty long period of time. There's ongoing research into vaccines, but I think we're years away. And even if we had a vaccine, we have a pretty significant logistical hurdle delivering it to millions of deer across such a large swath of North America. There's ongoing research into genetic resistance as well. But to date, there's no genotype identified that is truly resistant to CWD. They all seem to get CWD. Some just live longer with the disease than others. And once again, even if we had that genotype, how do we produce enough to alter genetic composition at the population level in the wild? Disinfectants for use with tools, surfaces, vehicles, and to mitigate environmental contamination in the wild. I think that would be an important tool if it could be developed. If we could somehow identify whether a deer had CWD remotely, then selectively remove only positives, then we could alter outcomes. But I wouldn't hold my breath on that tool coming anytime soon. Better tests, especially ones where we can determine whether CWD or is not in an area without ever even testing a deer. Science is making real progress on that one. But again, just knowing where disease is does not alter outcomes. It's still watching, but with a better tool to watch with. Again, we don't have these tools today, but I think it makes a lot of sense to do what we can to address CWD now. It'll be simpler to use these tools if and when they're developed, the smaller the footprint of CWD. So what do we have for tools today? Essentially, we have the same ones we've had for a very long time. Lethal removal of animals from affected populations. And that works both inside fences and in the wild. There's different ways, clearly, to use the tool, depending on your situation and goals. I'm not going to go into tremendous detail here, but this is the one that holds promise if wielded in an aggressive, sustained, and targeted manner. Last 2 points I think are really important as well. Are there impediments to removing deer in Pennsylvania today? Are there seasons, bag limits, restrictions on any group or cohort of deer that prevent willing hunters and landowners from taking this task on? And are there any mechanisms that the Commonwealth could adopt that might compel reluctant stakeholders to participate? Experience suggests that you're going to have to think outside the box to be successful with this disease. Good news is you don't have to start from scratch. And here's 2 resources that I highly recommend. AFWA, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, recently published a set of best management practices for CWD. And the Western states and provinces, who've been dealing with CWD longer than anyone else, published a set of adaptive management guidelines a few years ago. These are available online, and I would encourage anyone interested in CWD to take a look at them. So here's the core best management practices for actively dealing with CWD in the wild. It makes sense and represent what science and experience offer. First, targeting the deer most likely to have CWD. And remember, that begins with the adult males. Targeting animals in CWD hotspots, kind of like putting out a campfire before it shoots sparks out and lights the forest on fire. Adjusting season timing. Do you have open hunting during the peak of the rut? Do you allow the most efficient weapons to be used during the rut? Are there limits on the number and kind of deer that hunters can take? Reducing density in CWD zones. Lower the population, the lower the number of positives remaining on the landscape. Now, lowering density likely will not reduce prevalence, at least in the short run, but it will reduce that standing crop of positives. And from a disease perspective, that's a very good thing. And eliminating any practices that artificially congregate deer. Baiting, feeding, lures, both natural and artificial, all are designed to attract deer to a specific place and time, and all of those enhance the risk of deer-to-deer transmission. So we have tools that can be employed. But when we look at the maps, the prevalence curves, it doesn't seem like we're having a lot of success. But why is that? That's a photo of Aldo Leopold, who's known as the father of wildlife management and was a very prolific writer. Leopold identified wildlife management back in the 1930s as a 3-legged stool, and you have to have all 3 legs to be successful. Even in 1943, he recognized that people management was the hardest of the 3 legs. And CWD is a prime example of this. Dr. Jordan Pechenik is a retired social scientist from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and a human dimensions specialist. These next few slides are from a talk he gave shortly before he retired, and they're based on over 15 years of working with stakeholders on CWD in the state of Wisconsin. So in Wisconsin and elsewhere, including Pennsylvania, when CWD is initially detected, there's a lot of support for actively addressing CWD. It's the Game Commission's mission to provide healthy wildlife. Landowners generally do not want CWD, and hunters even support measures to harvest more deer. But there is a caveat. They have to be convinced that their individual efforts will make a difference. And even if there's strong support initially, it tends to wane over time. But why is that? Turns out there's a host of what Jordan referred to as restraining forces that push back against the will to support active CWD management, and eventually they overwhelm. Things like sharpshooting, bounties for deer, they're simply not popular. Evidence. Remember how few hunters have actually seen a CWD positive deer in clinical phase? Hunter ethic. Most hunt for sport and tradition, and asking them to be disease managers is very challenging. And even those that are willing, hunters have a consumption limit, and they're unlikely to harvest a lot of extra deer if they cannot use them. Many are not in favor of the type of population reduction that might be necessary to alter outcomes. Doubt. This creeps in over time. There's a lot of alternative theories floating around on the internet and social media that help fuel doubt. And what about risk? Many believe there's little to no risk to either deer or humans, and they're less likely to support intervention. So we begin with attitudinal support. Nobody wants CWD, but what we lack is behavioral support. That attitudinal support has failed to translate into sustained behavioral support for actively and aggressively managing CWD, in many places repeated over and over. So what are the issues at hand? Well, keeping CWD from moving further across your state and North America, managing the disease where it is today and in ways that can alter outcomes. You have to manage CWD in the commercial captive cervid industry, identifying risk factors and the pathways for disease movement, managing those factors. Misinformation is a real big one. We live in a society where misinformation can thrive and move incredibly rapidly and influence a lot of stakeholders. And if those stakeholders do not support the Game Commission, actively support the Game Commission, the trends you're already documenting are very likely to continue. So I'm going to finish up right where I started. The data, I'll be honest, don't look promising, but I absolutely believe it can be turned around. CWD can be managed, but it's not going to be simple. Outcomes can be altered. It will not be quick. And CWD management, as I try and identify, it's not an a la carte menu. If you merely enact a small handful of rather simplistic measures, you're likely to not alter outcomes. I think Commissioner Layton really nailed it in his comment that the only hope for making things better is for hunters to help wildlife managers. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you this evening. And I believe we're going to take questions later on after other speakers. And with that, I will turn it back over to Nick. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Much appreciated. And I'm glad you mentioned questions because I'm not doing the best job as your moderator this evening. One of the first things I should have told you is that if you have questions, if you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little Q&A tab there. It's right next to participants if you mouse over it. Please put your questions in there and then we will address them later on. There's also a chat feature. We don't want your questions to go in there. You can certainly use that feature, but we want your questions, if you would, please put them in the Q&A box. Okay. Kip Adams is here. He's going to talk about some really cool things and relates to this disease. So Kip, it's on to you.
All right. Thank you, Nick. And great job, Bill and Brian, kicking us off here. So my part of this, folks, is to take the science side of what Brian has shared with us here and make sure we really relate this down to a hunting level. And we understand kind of what the research shows and what the science says, but now what does this really mean to us as a hunter? And I'll start with this. I've been a wildlife biologist for over 25 years now. I'm extremely blessed to get to do that, but I am first and foremost a deer hunter. So I work with CWD I understand this from that side of it, but it really hits me hard from the hunting side as well. So I'm going to try to convey some of this tonight to just let us know what are the real implications to us as hunters. You know, if this disease is in our area, or if it's not, it's knocking at the door, what we want to do to absolutely keep it out. So with that, let's just start by talking about the importance of deer, and just recognizing what is it really here that we're trying to safeguard. And I know that some of the folks on the meeting here tonight are not deer hunters. So there might be deer enthusiasts or just wildlife enthusiasts. So I think most of the folks here are deer hunters, but not everybody. So anyway, let's just talk about the importance of deer. We know that 79% of American hunters pursue deer, which means that we have somewhere around 11 million deer hunters. Sometimes it feels like all of them are right here in Pennsylvania. They're not, although we do have more hunters per square mile than any other state in the entire country. But let's just show you here for a little bit of comparison. We know that we have 11 million deer hunters in any given year. We only have about 3 million turkey hunters. This is the second most hunted species. We only have about 1.5 million duck hunters, and we have less than 1 million elk hunters. And I'll say this, I love to hunt elk, ducks, and turkeys as well, specifically turkeys right now, given that our season is in. But there are far more deer hunters than all of these other species that we chase around. And what that means is that the deer drive the hunting industry. We know that they are the most sought after game species here in North America, and the deer hunters contribute about 60% of the 37 billion that's generated from hunting. Billion with a B. Hunting is huge business. And the cool thing about this is that most of our wildlife management efforts come from hunting. The revenue that comes in, license sales, the excise tax on the gear that we buy, and then the deer hunters contribute the majority of this. Right here in just Pennsylvania alone, hunting contributes about 1.6 billion annually to our economy. So it's a big deal. So it's very important we have healthy deer. If you care about any of the other wildlife species out there, other things that we hunt, non-game species, songbirds, anything, we should care that we have healthy deer, because much of what we get to fund wildlife management programs and ensure that we have wild places to go and healthy populations to either hunt or photograph or just see, a lot of this comes off the back of deer hunters. So this is a really big deal. Well, when we talk about CWD, hunters are often the ones, that are in the audience. That's because of the species that we know are susceptible to CWD. We like to hunt them. Things like mule deer, elk, black-tailed deer, white-tailed deer, moose, reindeer. These are all species that had CWD confirmed in them, and they're all things that we love to hunt. Are there others? Boy, there certainly could be. There's a possibility that other cervid species are susceptible to this disease as well. But this hits us hard, obviously, from a hunting standpoint. But hopefully I've impressed upon you a little bit the importance that these species have also for our wildlife management programs. So really all wildlife has some skin in this game relative to CWD. I think that Bill and Brian did a great job sharing some information with you, but I'm just going to reiterate one little thing here. And there's 3 points to this that really drive this home, and why we do not want CWD anywhere near where we live or hunt, or if we do, we want to do everything possible to keep it from spreading. We know for a fact that there is no vaccine for it. There's no cure for it. It is 100% fatal to all whitetails. None of these are good for the future of those deer herds. Specifically, when we talk about deer, and this is going to directly impact what we have to hunt, as well as what any state wildlife agency puts in place regulation-wise, we know that the probability of infection increases with age in both bucks and does, and that adult bucks are about twice as likely to be infected as the does. What that means is this is why you see some states wanting to reduce age structures in both bucks and does and drive deer herds lower. That is the single best way that we can keep this disease from spreading at this point. And since older bucks are far more likely to have it than younger bucks, that's why you hear talk about let's not let these bucks get into these mature age classes, because they are just far more likely to have the disease. I'm going to show you a picture here. This is one of the first 3 cases of CWD that was found in the wild in Wisconsin. This was during the hunting season back in the fall of 2001. They then confirmed it, and that's why you hear all the time about this being confirmed in Wisconsin in 2002. First time it was east of the Mississippi River, and this changed the whole landscape relative to CWD. Brian talked about, or showed you a picture of a deer and said, we don't know if this deer has CWD or not. We can't tell. Well, it's because he said that deer had this on average 18 to 24 months before they show any signs. So this deer here, take a look at it. You can see this deer is really thin. It is starting to show symptoms. It's wasting away. However, take a look at the antlers. This is a heck of a set of antlers on this deer. So what this lets us know is that this deer was very healthy during the antler growing phase, which is probably April to about August or late August of this year. And then it finally started showing some symptoms and then started losing weight here. However, I just use this to impress upon you that that's why, yeah, we really can't look at a deer, at least the vast majority of them, well over 99% of deer that have CWD, you can't look at them and know. Because something kills them before they get into those final stages where they start wasting away. Research shows us now that if a deer has CWD, it's 2 to 3 times more likely to die during this year of something that are other than a deer that does not have CWD. And some people say, well, if it's going to die anyway, then maybe that's not so bad. But that's not true. Think about any other wildlife species that you like, whether some that you hunt or don't hunt, or you like to photograph. If there's some segment of that population that is 2 to 3 times more likely to die this year, we certainly can look at that and realize this is not a good thing at all. So this is the same way with CWD. So not a good deal. Also, research shows us that deer with this disease are less active than deer that don't have it. So if you want to think of this from a hunting end, this is a really good reason to not want this in your area, because there has never been a deer hunter on the planet that goes hunting and thinks, man, I hope deer just simply are not active today. I hope all those deer are just locked down or they're bedded and they just don't walk anywhere near where I'm going to be hunting. Of course, that's crazy. We would never say that. But we know that this is a case with deer with CWD. They are less active. They spend less time on their feet, spend less time moving. So certainly not good for us from a hunting end. Well, how is CWD introduced into an area? One of the best ways for this is by movement of an infected captive deer. And I'm going to show you a map here. This is from a master's thesis showing these are known, recorded, legal movements of deer among captive deer facilities in Pennsylvania over a 10-year period. So, there's a big captive industry in our state here, and obviously a tremendous amount of movement. Now, we know that there's not an effective and a practical live animal test yet for CWD. We're getting a lot closer, that's for sure, and science is certainly helping us with this. But even as of now, there's not a good test that we have. So some deer are inadvertently moved, and this is not a bash on the captive industry at all. They don't want to move those deer either. It's just the reality of the situation. We can move deer without absolutely knowing if they have the disease or not. So this is a problem, and this is clearly how we have moved the disease around. Well, we also know that wild deer moving around too. Immigration of infected wild deer. Research shows that 1/2 to 3/4 of all of the buck fawns born in an area are going to disperse 1 to 5 miles from that area when they are 12 to 18 months of age. They're going to go set up a new home range. And if they have this disease, they're taking it with them. So that's the way that we can move the disease to a new area. And as hunters, we're not off the hook either, because another easy way to move the disease is by deer coming into contact with the remains of an infected deer. And what this means is Bill showed you at the very beginning a picture of a deer and talked about the high-risk parts. The high-risk parts of a deer are areas where the infectious materials accumulate. The eyes, the brain, the spleen, the lymph nodes, backbone. This is why as hunters, we see more and more regulations that do not allow us to move those high-risk parts of a deer that we shoot out of a disease zone or across the state line. There's a lot of states out there now that don't let you to bring any of this stuff in, regardless if you have found CWD in the state of origin or not. So this is a big deal. And this is something that as hunters, we really can do to help this. We can leave those high-risk parts after we shoot that deer right within that zone. Leave them in the field if possible. Get them to a landfill if possible, but not taking them out of that zone can do a great thing. And we can help ourselves here and not moving this disease into another area. All right, let's talk about some of the impacts then that this has on hunters and society as well. Well, deer population reduction is almost always the first step when CWD is identified. We take a situation like this and we say, you know what? We want to minimize congregation of deer because deer can give this to each other. Brian talked about all of the other prion diseases in the different species, like cattle, humans, etc. Well, with cattle, the mad cow disease, if a cow has it, you can have it in the pasture with 1,000 other cows. It's not going to give it to any of the other cows. I wish it was that way with deer, but unfortunately, CWD is not like that. If one of these deer have it, and they're in contact with all these other deer, unfortunately, it can transmit the disease to those other individuals. That's why our wildlife agencies have regulations to limit congregations. That's also why when CWD arrives, we have population reduction plans. We want to reduce deer herds, typically below even what the habitat can support, to minimize this contact. Now, obviously, as hunters, this hits us hard because, this like the old activity thing, no hunter goes hunting and thinks, man, I hope I see fewer deer today than I did yesterday. There may be situations where we probably should see fewer if deer herds are overabundant, but we want to see deer. I'm the same way. I want to see deer. When I take people hunting, I want them to see deer. But the reality of it is, once we're in a disease zone like this, it is in our best interest to reduce these deer herds, to minimize spread of this, to make sure that we can assure we have healthy deer to be able to hunt 5, 10, and 50 years down the road. In many cases, once you get the disease, it's the end of deer season as you know it. And you know what? I grew up in northern Pennsylvania in a very traditional hunting camp. I'm very blessed and still hunt at that same camp today. So I know how tied we are to our culture as deer hunters. Pennsylvania hunters want the season to start on the same day. They want to have the same guys and gals in camp. They want to be able to go to sit at that same spot that they had before. We want things to remain like that. Well, as soon as this disease arrives, that all goes out the window. We end up with CWD check stations and CWD samples, which means in many cases now you're going home with a headless deer. Is this an inconvenience? It absolutely is. However, if you care about deer and wanting to hunt in the future, it is an inconvenience that is absolutely worth doing to ensure that we can provide samples so our Pennsylvania Game Commission can then or have an estimate of prevalence of a disease in an area, an estimate of rate of spread within that area, because based on prevalence rate and how widely it's spread, it gives them some measure of how soon or how long the disease has been in the area. And then based on that, it gives them different ways to be able to attack it. And Andrew will talk about some of that later here. But this is certainly something that is an inconvenience, but it's absolutely one that we have to do. We also, once you get this, you end up with movement regulations. We can't move those high-risk parts out, and this is a very good thing. We often end up with longer hunting seasons, additional hunting seasons, sharpshooting. All these other things come into play where we're trying to remove more CWD positive deer off the landscape, trying to minimize spread of this and basically allow the science to catch up so that we can find a cure for this. So we're fighting hard to keep this as tightly regulated as possible so that when we do find a cure, we're still able to effectively administer it to our deer herds. Once you get it, there's a loss of privileges because we don't want to congregate deer. No more feeding, no more baiting, no using minerals. Many states ban urine attractants because we don't want deer in and together mixing. We know that these infectious agents for this disease are spread via urine, saliva, blood, feces. So that's why we don't want deer swapping spit at mineral licks or feed sites. So from a hunting end, maybe you use some bait to survey the deer herd on a place each year. There's formalized techniques to be able to do this with camera surveys. Being able to use bait is a great way if that's legal. So, however, if you're in a disease zone, this goes out the window. Can't do that anymore. Can't use minerals if even to photograph deer or to scout deer pre-deer season. So is this an inconvenience? It surely is, but I'm hoping that I'm at least making you realize, the importance of these and why it is really good that we don't do this. A counterpart of mine in the state of Missouri has a great photo actually of a deer that later tested positive for CWD standing in a mineral lick, drooling into this lick that was full of water. So clearly shedding the infectious materials right here where other deer were coming in and licking. And there's two sets of eyes right behind it, other deer waiting for this deer to leave to come in and then lick the minerals and the water out of that lick. So that pictures are worth 1,000 words for sure. And that picture is worth about 10,000 words relative to CWD. And one of the reasons that we don't want mixing of spit at these feed sites or at these mineral licks. We know that mature bucks are often not encouraged once we have this disease. And that is because older bucks are far more likely to have it, which means then they're more likely to transfer it to others. So often we're looking at driving deer populations younger. And really on paper, if you look at it, the best way to battle this is to reduce deer herds from both the buck side and the doe side and to drive age structures very young on both sides. So, however, we know in the real world, it's difficult to get hunters to do that. And as Brian said, in almost every case, hunters have not been willing to do that. So oftentimes there's a little trade-off to get hunters to shoot enough deer to at least try to reduce deer herds or keep them in balance while still helping drive some of these age structures young. You might be amazed to realize actually how few hunters are successful during the year. You get your license. Most states give you a bag limit of one or more bucks, and then one or more does. Georgia's a perfect example. Buy a license, you get the opportunity to shoot 10 bucks or 2 bucks and 10 antlerless deer. People think, man, they're going to kill all the deer there. But the reality of it is only about 41% of hunters across the United States in any given year are successful, meaning they shoot at least one deer. That's it. And only about 18% of hunters shoot more than one. So think about that. Less than 1 out of 5 deer hunters out of that 11 million pool, less than 1 out of 5 are going to shoot more than one deer this year. So what this means is from a hunting end, we really have to step up our game and help this out. We need to be shooting more deer, more bucks and does to help balance these deer herds, to reduce these deer herds, and then to reduce some of these age structures. And you know what? Some people just won't say, I just can't eat anymore. I don't want it. Man, we have the perfect solution to this. About 1 out of 7 households in the US today are food insecure, which means they don't have enough protein. So think about this. Here we are. We have more deer than we should have. We have a great opportunity as hunters to help ensure the safety and the health of the future of our deer herd, and at the same time feed people that need to be fed. It is a win-win all the way around. And we can really help our public image here because only about 4% of the US population buys a hunting license. You'll hear some people say, it's my God-given right to hunt, and I'll always be able to do this. And you know what? I wish that was true, but we don't get to do anything in the United States because 4% of us want to do it. We get to hunt because about 80% of the American adults, those that are 16 years age and older, support hunting, support legal, ethical, regulated hunting. So if we can remove excess deer and feed people, that just helps our public image even more and ensure that we maintain that high level of public support for hunting. And that is a great win-win opportunity for us. Well, we know once we have CWD that we end up with some of this license money that's diverted from herd and habitat management to CWD sampling and monitoring and surveillance. And this is absolutely needed. This has to happen, but it's expensive. It is really, really expensive. In Wisconsin, the Wisconsin DNR has spent over $50 million since they've confirmed this disease on this. Is this needed? It's absolutely needed, but it's too bad that they had to spend it all. Think instead of on that, if they could have spent it on hunter access programs, land purchases, habitat enhancement programs for public land. Think about how much better this could be for us if they didn't have this disease. So they would much rather spend it on this too. But thankfully, they are spending it on disease there, to help learn more about this and help other states. So it's a very expensive endeavor. We know that once you get it, hunting participation can decline. I'm going to share Wisconsin again because they've had it the longest. This is the last year that Wisconsin was pre-CWD, or last year that they knew it. And this is how many hunt licenses they sold, how many paid hunt license holders they had. They confirmed it during this hunting season. So the next year, the number dropped. It dropped a bunch. By 2003, it came back a little bit, but in the next 10-year period, it never did recover to what it was at the beginning. And some people say, you know what, if we have fewer hunters, that's not that big of a deal because I don't want people hunting where I hunt anyway. Well, that's a pretty short-sighted view because fewer hunters leads to less money for wildlife, and fewer hunters leads to less advocates for hunting. And neither one of these are good for our future. We know there's economic repercussions once you get this. In Missouri, once CWD was first confirmed, land prices were reduced $200 to $400 per acre. And this is because there's no way to decontaminate a site. Once the infectious materials are there, at least from all the data and science that we have right now, we do not know, or we don't have the ability yet. We're getting closer. However, we don't have the ability yet to decontaminate a site. So land values can suffer dramatically. We know that no state has won the CWD battle. These prions remain in the soil for years, possibly decades. The disease continues to spread through deer herds. So once it's there, it is there. So all the more reason that if you don't have it, to do everything possible to keep it out. All right, I'm going to show you a few slides here that kind of take off a little bit of what Brian was sharing. These are from Wisconsin. And take a look back here at 2002. This is when the disease was first confirmed. This is as you see in the red blob here, South Central Iowa County in Wisconsin. I'm going to show you, we'll just talk about the adult bucks, and they're classifying these as bucks that were 2.5 and older. So the solid blue line. So back in 2002, somewhere around 1% of the adult bucks in this area had the disease. Now fast forward 12 to 13 years and look at this. It went from about 1% of the adult bucks having this to about 30% of them. And man, this growth curve has no look in sight of slowing down at all. And this isn't a cherry-picked county by any means. Take a look. This is southeastern Richland County. 35% of the bucks here had it. And this was from about 06 to 14. So a much shorter time period. Here is north central Iowa County. This is about 3% up to 45%. So flip a coin and the buck has it or not. And the thing with this is we know this is not good, right? We can look at Wisconsin and say, man, this is a terrible situation. But the reality of it is here in Pennsylvania, we are on the exact same plane of these growth curves. We're just much earlier in the process. This is all the more reason that we are bringing this information to our hunters to help so that they can do everything possible to help limit this. So we don't want to end up with this situation. And this is exactly what is going to happen if we don't take drastic measures here in the Commonwealth. So we're seeing this implications for deer management, fewer mature bucks, absolutely. Lower deer densities, yep. Fewer disease-free deer, absolutely. We know all of this is going to happen. Wisconsin is the perfect example. And we are on the exact same path if we don't do something to change this. Another big thing with this is from the eating end of it. Is CWD positive venison safe to eat? Well, both the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control say that there's currently no evidence that humans can contract the human form of this, which is Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, from eating CWD infected deer. However, they both strongly encourage people to not eat deer or venison that has CWD. So if you're in a disease zone, I encourage you to get that deer tested and do not eat it until you receive a satisfactory test back. The National Deer Association strongly encourages to do the same thing. But we know there's people out there that don't follow that advice. They say, you know what, we've been eating it, we're going to continue to eat it. And I hope that we can get past some of that and realize, hey, let's follow what the science shows us. Let's be the smartest that we can and the safest that we can. But even if you choose to go ahead and not follow their advice, eat it yourself, hopefully that I can convince you to at least share some venison with others this year. Maybe take an extra deer and help out deer herds or deer or CWD management program and feed somebody that needs to be, helped from that end of it. But think about this, even if you choose to eat some of that, are you going to feed that, to a little boy, your little boy or your little girl, or maybe a niece or nephew or a little boy down the street, a little boy or a girl at church? So, you know what? It's a simple thing to get tested. Our Game Commission provides tremendous opportunities for this. Bill spoke about this a little bit. Andrew will speak more about this. So I hope I can encourage you that if you're hunting in a disease zone, get that deer tested. That helps the Game Commission understand more about the disease. It helps them better battle it. And at the same time, ensures that you're either eating or feeding something that's safe to your family, friends, or somebody in your neighborhood. All right. So that's some of the implications. This is what it means to us. This is how it changes it. Let's talk a little bit now about what were we really trying to safeguard here? What does this mean for us in Pennsylvania? And everybody likes to pick on the Game Commission. Everybody likes to attack the Game Commission. Well, let's just look at kind of nationally how our hunting fits in here in the Keystone State compared to many other states. Well, at the National Deer Association, we compile an annual deer report where we collect data from every single state wildlife agency on the number of bucks and does they shot, on the age structure of those, and how all this fits in. So we can actually compare this. If we take a look at the top 5 states in the country for killing antler bucks, Texas is almost always first, but they're the biggest, right? They're a huge state. They got a lot of deer hunters, a lot of good things go on there. But Pennsylvania, we're always in the top 5 lists for total numbers of antler bucks. But if you look at this really isn't a fair apples to apples comparison, right? Texas is a lot bigger than Pennsylvania or Michigan, and there are smaller states that just aren't as big. So how do they compare? Well, we also take a look at this buck harvest on a per square mile basis to give us a little better measure of apples to apples. And what we find here is we fare even better about that. We are number 2 and just knocking on the door for number 1. Michigan's the only state in the country that harvests more bucks per square mile than us, and it is a fraction more. Well, let's take a look at the antlerless deer side, because this is really where the rubber meets the road. If we don't harvest enough antlerless deer, deer herds grow too high, deer herds become unhealthy, habitats unhealthy, other wildlife species are negatively impacted. So this is really the measure of a good deer management program. Well, once again, Texas leads the list here, but take a look at this. We're number 2 on this list. And just like with the bucks, we can look at this on a per square mile basis, and we find we are right at the top of this as well. And I want you to take a look here. Look at the top 4 states here: Delaware, PA, Maryland, and New Jersey. Obviously, we look at these on the map. These are all in the mid-Atlantic region. And you know what? That's because we are in a real sweet spot relative to deer herds. We have extremely productive deer herds here. We pump a lot more fawns into the system than a lot of other states. And so we have a lot of deer. It allows us to shoot a lot. Pennsylvania hunters are good at shooting a lot. But the reality of it is we need to shoot even more. If you take a look at this, what we have a growing deer herd, even though we're harvesting at these extremely high rates. So all of us Pennsylvania hunters, we can help ourselves, we can help this deer herd, and we can help our disease management efforts if we take in additional deer this coming year. That would be great for us. And obviously not everybody can do that, but if we strive to do that, we will put ourselves in a much better spot. So I'm going to end here and say, like Pennsylvania rocks. And if you look at a summary, we absolutely do. We are one of only 3 states in the country to shoot more than 300,000 deer annually in 2019. And I say this because the 2020 harvest, there's some states out there that haven't analyzed all of that data yet. Here in Pennsylvania, we have, but some haven't. So this is the most recent season where we have a complete data set around the country to compare. So in that most recent season, we harvested over 3.5 antler bucks per square mile. Michigan's the only state that shot more, as I just said. For the 11th year in a row, over half of our antler buck harvest was at least 2.5 years old. And in fact, it was the highest percentage ever recorded, which obviously in a natural situation, this is a very, very good thing. But as we've said tonight, some problems come in here now once you have the disease. So it's something that we have to keep a very close eye on and try to help. From the antlerless side, Delaware is the only state that shot more than us on a per square mile basis. And look at this bottom figure here. PA hunters, we shot almost 9 deer per square mile. There is not a single state in the country that shot more deer per square mile than we did. We are tied for number 1 with this. So we get to shoot a lot of deer. That's a lot of fun. That's a blessing. But at the same time, there's a responsibility that comes with this for us to be able to shoot even more to keep deer herds where we need to be and help us from a disease standpoint. So current status with this then is that there's a lot of concern about the increased spread of this disease, both into new states and in new areas within states where we've already identified it. And then there's much concern about the future of wildlife, certainly for our deer herds and our deer hunting, but then all wildlife management because of the importance that deer and deer hunters have on this. So is CWD the end of deer hunting? I'm going to say no. I'm an optimist. So no, but we must be vigilant to minimize transmission of this in existing areas where we have it, to prevent introduction of this into new areas where we don't have it yet. And we absolutely need to support research on this and the Game Commission's efforts with this disease. We've talked about some of the things tonight that we can do, like not moving high-risk parts, like harvesting an additional deer, like making sure we get our deer sampled if we're in a disease zone and share that information with the Game Commission to allow them to do a better job. So there's a lot of risk here. There's certainly a lot at stake. This is a document from our website. You can go to deerassociation.com and download this. This is our recommended practices for deer hunters. If you're in a disease zone, it talks about some habitat stuff you can do. It talks about hunting stuff you can do in ways to be able to attack this disease. And there is absolutely something that every single hunter can do to help with this fight. So we try to share that information so that we all can get behind this effort. So with that, this is my email address. We're going to take questions here tonight, and you're welcome to ask. But after tonight, if you have at any point want to talk about deer or have questions about any of this, please email me. I am glad to be able to help. And with all of that, I will turn it over or back to Nick to be able to turn it over here to Andrea so that she can share then now that you've kind of heard about the disease and what's at stake, what our Game Commission is doing to help protect this precious resource for us for a long time into the future.
Thank you, Kip. Appreciate that Pennsylvania perspective. And now we're going to find out what the Pennsylvania Game Commission is doing. And with us tonight, we have Andrea Corman. She is the CWD biologist. So Andrea, take it away.
All right, thanks, Nick. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, can you see that all right?
Yep.
All right. So good evening, everybody. I'm going to start us off talking a little bit about the history of CWD in Pennsylvania. So CWD surveillance in Pennsylvania has been ongoing since 1998. And as of today, over 107,000 deer and nearly 1,600 elk have been tested for CWD. In 2003, the first Pennsylvania interagency CWD response plan was developed by agencies like the Game Commission and Pennsylvania Department of Ag, USDA, and there were also many others. This was also the beginning of statewide sampling, where previously only clinical suspects were tested for CWD. Then in 2006, authority over the captive cervid industry was actually transferred from the Game Commission to Pennsylvania Department of Ag. So in Pennsylvania, CWD is managed under 2 different agencies, which can be challenging. Then in 2012, we had our first detections of CWD in Pennsylvania. And then in July of last year, our agency response plan was approved by the Board of Commissioners, and we began implementing it that fall. Now, going back to our first detections in October 2012, CWD was detected in a captive facility represented by the yellow star on the map in Adams County, which resulted in the creation of Disease Management Area, or DMA 1. And that facility was depopulated. Then 2 months later, 3 hunter-harvested free-ranging deer, shown by the red dots on the map, tested positive in Blair and Bedford counties, which resulted in the establishment of DMA 2. Now, given the distance, these events are not necessarily related, so it's hard to say exactly how CWD got into Pennsylvania. Then DMA 3 was created in 2014 after CWD was detected in 2 captive facilities in Jefferson County. And then DMA 1 was dissolved in 2017 because it went 5 consecutive years without any additional CWD detections. In 2018, DMA 4 was created after CWD was detected in a captive cervid facility in Lancaster County. So within DMAs, there is a ban on removing high-risk parts, feeding deer, and using urine-based attractants. Now, even with those restrictions in place and increased surveillance, DMAs have continued to expand and more deer test positive each year. And if the trajectory of the disease increases in Pennsylvania, like it has in other states, the infection rate in portions of Blair, Bedford, and Fulton counties will likely exceed 30% in the next 1 to 2 decades, and it will continue to spread across the Commonwealth. So the revised and updated response plan establishes a framework for managing CWD in Pennsylvania. Currently, the best management strategy to control CWD is to reduce deer abundance in infected areas, to slow the rate of disease transmission, and remove infected individuals from the landscape. Many of the strategies in the plan focus on ways to limit spread of the disease and prevent it from becoming established in new areas. So the response plan identifies 4 different types of management areas. So we have disease management areas, the established area, enhanced surveillance units, and containment zones. And each one of those is associated with different objectives and strategies. So these are our current DMAs, or disease management areas. And a DMA is created when new CWD detections are found in either free-ranging or captive deer, regardless of proximity to any previous detections. And a 10-mile buffer is placed around each detection. Now that 10 miles is used because it encompasses the dispersal distances of most deer in Pennsylvania, and it includes the area where a positive deer may have been spreading prions. And depending on the location of the detection, it might have no effect, it might result in the expansion of an existing DMA, or it could cause a whole new DMA to be created. And the purpose of a DMA is to reduce the human-assisted spread of CWD. Sampling is also increased to detect CWD spread from known locations. Feeding deer is prohibited, along with the use of natural urine-based attractants. Both of those can cause increased congregation of deer and can therefore increase transmission of the disease. High-risk parts also cannot be taken outside the DMA. And I'll define high-risk parts more later, but generally we're talking about the brain and the spinal column. We also increased antlerless allocations in wildlife management units that have had CWD detections in order to reduce deer abundance and further limit the spread of the disease. And head collection bins are also provided for hunters to submit deer heads for testing to increase sampling and surveillance. So next we have our established area. We currently only have one, and it can be found within DMA 2. And an established area is characterized by CWD detections that occur contiguously across a large area and consistently from year to year. And in an established area, CWD is considered established within the deer population, and coupled with environmental contamination poses a long-term threat to neighboring areas. Now, this area currently covers primarily Blair, Bedford, and Fulton counties, or in terms of wildlife management units, we'd be looking at 4A and a portion of 2C. And over 90% of our positives have come from this area. So in an established area, the extent of CWD infection is more significant than in other areas. And the goal here is to maintain sample prevalence at or below 5% and minimize the movement of high-risk parts to other areas. So 5% was chosen because data from other states and models show that once that threshold is crossed, disease prevalence accelerates drastically, making management of the disease even more difficult. So to reach this goal, reducing deer abundance is the primary management strategy for this area, and this is done through increased hunter harvest and helps reduce the potential for disease transmission and also removes additional positive deer from the landscape. Due to the degree of infection in this area, transport of high-risk parts outside the established area is prohibited, and that's a new regulation for this year. Other DMA restrictions also apply, so there is no feeding deer or using natural urine-based attractants in the established area either. Now, I mentioned the goal of 5% or less for sample prevalence in the established area. Based on hunter-harvested adult deer, our sample prevalence in the established area has been above 5% since the 2018 season and is now actually close to 14%. So it's clear that there is a significant problem in the established area. Next, we have enhanced surveillance units. So these are individual areas within DMAs that are created when there is a new CWD detection, again, in either a free-ranging or captive deer, that is greater than 5 miles from any other past detection. An enhanced surveillance unit is created by using an approximately 3 to 5 mile radius buffer around an isolated detection. Now, this buffer was chosen to balance the need to focus surveillance efforts in the area where a CWD infected deer was likely to have traveled and still be able to collect enough samples to meet the target sample size. So in these new areas, the extent and sample prevalence of CWD are unknown. And each enhanced surveillance unit has an associated DMAP unit. So to the public, this looks and functions just like any other DMAP unit. And these areas highlighted in pink on the map are the 8 that we created last year. So the purpose of an ESU is to determine the extent and sample prevalence of CWD through increased sampling. And this is primarily achieved through increased hunter harvest. The target sample size for each unit is approximately 250 to 300 deer to give us an adequate confidence that we would detect the disease if it is in a small percentage of the population within that unit. And hunters can also purchase up to 2 additional antlerless tags per unit to help meet those sample goals. And last year, hunter participation was relatively good, with all but 1 unit selling at least 50% or more of available permits. We also exceeded our target sample size in 4 of those units. And in the units where we did not reach 250 samples, we still received good numbers, and those samples from those units will still be informative. And last but not least, we have the containment zones. So these are the smallest geographic areas consisting of an approximately 1 mile radius buffer around the location of a new CWD detection. And this size is based on a deer's average home range and includes the individuals it was most likely to come in contact with and potentially infect. And this area represents our best option to suppress the impact of an initial CWD detection. And now this is just an example map with a hypothetical enhanced surveillance unit and containment zone, so you can see just how small that containment zone really is. And our purpose here is to prevent the establishment and spread of CWD by removing the most high-risk deer from the area immediately surrounding a CWD detection. And management strategies in these areas might include things like increased hunter harvest and targeted removals to ensure that those deer most likely to have come in contact with the positive detection are removed. And given the small scale of these areas, communication and outreach to landowners for hunting access is also a regular part of the process. And targeted removals do not occur unless we have permission from the landowner. So moving on to some of our other management strategies, we already know that it's unlawful to remove or export high-risk cervid parts from a DMA or the established area. And it is also unlawful to import these parts from any state or province outside Pennsylvania. That is also a new regulation this year. And like Bill mentioned earlier, those high-risk parts include the head, but more specifically the brain, eyes, lymph nodes, and tonsils, along with the spinal cord and spleen. And these are considered high risk because prions concentrate in high densities in those locations. And the importance of the regulations is to prevent people from dumping high-risk parts on the landscape in uninfected areas, possibly contaminating the soil in that area or even exposing healthy deer or elk to the disease. And I've mentioned reducing deer numbers to slow the rate of disease transmission and to remove diseased individuals from the landscape. So how exactly do we go about doing that? The best way is to increase hunter harvest, and in very specific situations, use targeted removals. We can and have actually increased hunter harvest in several ways. So we can increase antlerless harvest at the wildlife management unit scale through antlerless license allocations, or we can do it at a smaller scale using DMAP permits in those enhanced surveillance units. Concurrent firearm seasons also give hunters more flexibility to use those opportunities. And successful management of CWD cannot occur without hunters. Their cooperation is essential, and removing barriers to participation like limited time to hunt is one way to do this. Targeted removals are an option in certain areas with specific objectives. So these, again, are small-scale operations carried out by wildlife professionals from USDA Wildlife Services and only occur post-hunting season. These efforts are heavily dependent on landowner participation, and like I said, removals will only occur on properties where access has been permitted. Our surveillance efforts are critical in detecting new cases of CWD and tracking the spread and sample prevalence of the disease. In addition to testing white-tailed deer, we do also test elk, and nearly all hunter-harvested elk are tested, along with roadkill and clinical suspect elk. And so far, no elk has tested positive, and no deer from within the elk management area have tested positive. But we have had over 700 CWD positive deer since it was initially detected in 2012. Now for deer, we collect samples through a variety of methods, including hunter harvest from voluntary samples from head collection bins, which are only located within DMAs, as well as hunter harvest samples collected from meat processors statewide. Contractors are also employed to collect roadkill deer from state and local roads within and around the perimeter of DMAs. And those are probably our most important samples. They are actually often the first indication that the disease is expanding into new areas. And clinical suspects are also collected statewide. To help the public stay current with our sampling efforts, we also have a new dashboard that you can access from our main CWD page. You can find it under CWD test results and surveillance data. So it allows you to see our most up-to-date sampling data and consists of 3 different pages. So you can see our samples over time, sample prevalence, and sample statistics. And the sample prevalence page you see here contains a series of filters and maps to provide information at different scales. And we're also working with PDA to develop one showing information for the captive industry, and that should be available to the public relatively soon. And as part of the Game Commission's efforts to effectively manage CWD and other wildlife diseases, the Wildlife Futures program was started in 2019. And Wildlife Futures is a partnership between the Game Commission and the University of Pennsylvania's School of Veterinary Medicine. And this program combines wildlife disease expertise and research from Penn Vet with the Game Commission's commitment to protecting, managing, and promoting wildlife in Pennsylvania. So Wildlife Futures has a CWD diagnostic lab that provides 2 types of testing, including a more rapid test that has helped improve turnaround times. So in other words, we can notify a hunter of their deer's test results within days rather than weeks. And some of the CWD research they're doing includes work to develop a rapid field test for CWD using biomarkers from infected deer, and also development of procedures where dogs are actually trained to detect CWD in deer feces. And for more information on their research and other services, you can visit the Wildlife Futures website at this link. And we also have this phone number and email available for the public to use for any CWD related questions. So that's all I have, and thank you all very much.
Thank you, Andrea. Appreciate that very much. Folks, we're going to get into the question and answer period. And our speakers, it's like you all have done this before. You always finish right on time. So thank you. We have, I see 2 questions, which I will get into here in a second, but we still have time to get some more in. So if you have them, I encourage you to do that. If not, it'll be a brief Q&A session this evening. So let's go ahead and get into them. I'm going to throw this one to you, Brian Richards. What is the status of Dr. Bastian's CWD research that suggests the disease is from a bacteria which may be treatable?
Okay, thanks, Nick. Well, I don't follow, I can't say that I would follow, be a follower of Dr. Bastian's or any other alternative theory for the causative agent of CWD, so I don't know where his research is at today. What I will do is paraphrase a statement that came out from the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, AFWA, back in 2019. And that goes on to a lot of the things we've discussed tonight, that TSEs, or transmissible spongiform encephalopathies, are, including CWD, have been studied for decades, literally decades, to look at the cause and understanding and potential treatment. And the scientific consensus that has emerged from this research indicates that prions, or misfolded proteins, are the causative agents of TSEs, including CWD. And that this is accepted by a vast majority of scientists working in the field. So, research by anyone looking at potential mechanisms to help us understand disease etiology is valuable. But at this point in time, I think that my money would be on the guy with the Nobel Prize, and that's Dr. Stanley Proisner, who hypothesized that prions are the causative agents of TSEs over 25 years ago, or close to 25 years ago.
Yeah, great answer. Anyone want to add anything? I think that's pretty solid. Thanks, Brian. Next question. This is a little more lengthy, so hang with me here. I'm a property owner in Unit 3C, Springville Township, Susquehanna County. We have a large deer herd. It has become hard to find a doe large enough to harvest. They are skinny and small, overpopulated. Our forest has little regeneration. This year is the first year since 1996 that we had winter kill. There are just too many deer for the land to support. Why have our antlerless permits cut 16,000 when you were stating we need fewer deer to slow the spread of CWD? So Andrea, as being our Pennsylvania Game Commission representative, I'll let you take that one, and then others can chime in.
Sure, and Bill may be able to speak a little more as to the specific location with 3C, but a lot of the way we determine allocations is here lately. If a WMU has had CWD detections, then we do increase allocations, because the best way to reduce that sample prevalence and reduce the risk of spreading CWD is to lower the deer numbers in that infected area. And since the Northeast hasn't had CWD yet, we haven't increased the allocations in that particular area. Now, the other component that comes into play is also forest health. And so it's not simply based on deer densities. We're also looking at the forest health and based allocations off of that as well. And so that's likely what's coming into play in 3C. And Bill, I don't know if you have anything to add, or even anybody else to that.
I don't. The Bureau of Wildlife Management makes recommendations to the Board of Commissioners for the recommended antlerless allocations. That's done on a wildlife management unit scale. So there certainly may be areas within a WMU where you may see conditions that don't seem to match up with what the biologists are recommending. So it's difficult to say with a smaller area like that. But forest health is one of the factors that is considered.
Hey, Harry, I'll add one thing to that too, and great question. And I think a thing to remember is, as hunters, we hunt at the property level. All of the antlerless harvest recommendations are made at the WMU level, which is far larger than any property. So given the unit you're in, I'm sure there's areas in that have way more deer than there should be, probably areas that have fewer deer than the habitat could support, and then some that are right about level with that. So it sounds like you're in an area that definitely has more deer than that habitat can support, given what you're seeing with that deer herd, the lack of regeneration in the forest. So given that, even if the Game Commission has reduced antlerless allocations for that unit, you still could realize in your area, man, we need to shoot more here. So, I would strongly encourage you to be able to fill any of those antlerless tags you can get. If you have the opportunity to get into the DMAP program, that could provide additional antlerless tags for you. And one thing to remember as well is it's not an exact science when these antlerless tags are given out. And in many cases, if you have gone to the Game Commission meetings over the years, the wildlife biologists typically advocate or ask for a lot more antlerless tags in these units than often end up being allocated by the commissioners. Board of Commissioners have a final say on that, and they use, the biology that's given to them by the biologist. They take a look at the politics of this. So a lot more goes into those final allocations than just what the biologist will recommend. So many different pieces to that puzzle. But in your case, definitely sounds like we need to do everything possible to help reduce that deer herd there. And I would battle that from both ends. I would either take new hunters and you can mentor folks, do whatever to shoot more deer. But I would also encourage you if you have the ability to enhance that habitat as well, so that it does provide more food and cover for that existing deer herd. And we have all kinds of information we can help with on that as well. So feel free to get with me afterwards, or you can go to our website at deerassociation.com and look up some of that habitat stuff. But that's definitely a good way to attack that from both ends.
And Kip, I'd like to add one more thing. The Northeast region went from a split season to a concurrent antlerless and antlered season this year. So that was a factor in determining the number of antlerless allocations that were decided upon for the WMUs in the Northeast.
Great addition, Bill. Great addition. Hey, Nick, I got one question emailed to me before this. Everybody pre-registers for this meeting, and when they get their pre-registration link, it says if you have any questions, you can email them. So my email address is on that, and I did get one such email to me. And Andrea, I think this will be addressed to you. Said, hey, if I'm in a disease zone, or in the past I was hunted in a disease zone, harvested a doe, submitted it for testing. Good job with that. The doe came back, the disease was not found. So this person said, what value was there to me for even submitting this, given it wasn't found? And I know we touched on some of that here tonight, but I think that is a good question and a very valid answer. So Andrea, I'll let you address that.
Sure. Well, first, we do provide this partly as a service to hunters. They do strongly encourage you not to consume CWD positive meat, even though there hasn't been evidence of humans getting the disease. The potential is still there. And so we're kind of doing this partly as a service to hunters to make sure, you're hunting in an infected area. You might want to make sure that your deer is, either not detected, or just so you know one way or the other. And from an agency standpoint, a not detected is just as important as a detected. It's giving us an idea of what the sample prevalence is in that area. It helps us track if the disease is spreading from that area, and if that sample prevalence is increasing over time, as it has in our established area. So providing those head bins and you all providing the samples is a huge help to our surveillance effort.
Good deal. Very nice, Andrea. And for folks here that hunt in Pennsylvania, maybe only in Pennsylvania, Nick and I have the pleasure of working in 25 to 30 different states a year. We work with CWD across the whitetails range, and not every hunter in other states has or is afforded the luxury of making it easy to have deer sampled. Some states, the sample bins are much fewer and farther between. It's difficult for hunters to get stuff sampled. Turnaround time is not as fast in many cases as we have here. So we're very, very lucky here in Pennsylvania with what the Game Commission gives us, for ease of sampling and then providing those information back to us. So being a Pennsylvania native, I'm very proud of that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kip. Okay. I want to remind folks too that this is being recorded. So if you know somebody that should see this, maybe somebody that couldn't get here this evening to see it live, these will be up on the National Deer Association YouTube channel. We turn that around pretty quickly. So look for that. You can certainly get it to them. We also have a couple more opportunities. Is this the third or fourth one we've done? I guess this would be the third.
Mm-hmm.
We have, they're all running together. We have 3 more that we're going to be doing, and you don't have to, for example, live in the South Central region to see the South Central presentation. So you could happening in some of the other regions that'll be coming up. So with that, thank you very much for taking part of your evening out to be with us and to learn more about this disease. It's an all hands on deck issue here, and your being here shows that you care about it, and we certainly appreciate that. So with that, have a great evening, everybody. Happy hunting if you're out there turkey hunting still. Have a great evening. Thanks.